action potential. We talked about synapses last time. And today we're really going to tie all that together and sort of zoom out and look at the big picture of how the nervous system works. We're going to talk about the neurons, their supporting cells, which are called glial cells, and then some of the functions of those neurons. We'll also speak about the blood-brain barrier, the meninges, which are things we look at in the anatomy lab, and just really tying the nervous system, structure and function together. Okay, so the central nervous system is really comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Again, a lot of what we're going to speak about today ties into what we did in the lab, so this should be a good review for you. The brain, which is the delicate organ that sits in the cranial cavity, and then the continuation, which is housed in the vertebral column, is the spinal cord. It's necessary for maintaining homeostasis. Right? This is a theme that we've been seeing throughout this course so far. The brain is vital, it's crucial in maintaining homeostasis. Can anyone think of a way that the brain does that? So if you think about the structures we talked about in the homeostasis, so sensors and receptors and effector organs, where does the brain fit in all of that? Where does the brain fit in all of that? So a little bit of a review here.
Works in the feedback loops.
Good, so it's in the feedback loop. Can anyone think of the name of that center or that area that you described the brain as in that loop? The integrating center, right? The integrating center. So the brain is sort of that CEO, the central command, that really takes information from our sensory perception and relays a signal out to those effector tissues. And in such, it is vital to maintaining homeostasis. Now, in talking about synapses, we understand that there are tons of neurons, so about 100 billion, and even more synapses, because one neuron can synapse in many directions. So we have about 100 trillion synapses in the nervous system. And so lots of communication happening between different parts of the brain, lots of different directions. So things are going in towards the CNS from our sensory perception, things we see and touch and feel. And then effector organs are receiving information or communication in the opposite direction. So there's a bi-directional flow. Right? Things are going into the nervous system, things are coming out. So in that way, the brain is responsible for everything, pretty much everything we do, right? Emotions, actions, touching, feeling, everything we see, hear, all of that information is processed in the central nervous system via those neurons and their supporting cells. Okay, so if you touch a hot stove, the minute your hand touches that heat, sensory receptors pick up that temperature, pick up that excess temperature, and we pull our hand away before we can even process that we've touched something hot. And this is the way that the brain, and more specifically the spinal cord in that example, maintains homeostasis and brings about responses to everything, touch and feel and so on. Lastly here, the brain is the least understood of our organ system. This is something we mentioned in the lab, last week. There's a lot that still is not quite understood about the brain. An example that we saw already are the electrical synapses. Right? We don't know much about them. We know that they're different from chemical synapses. And we know some examples where they're found. But outside of that, we don't quite understand much about electrical synapses and lots of other areas of the brain. So for those of you who are interested in research careers or who are interested in the brain overall, this is an area that is really ripe and rich for research. All right. So these are the topics that we're really going to touch on today, neurons, which are the main functional units. These are the excitable cells of the nervous system. Then we have glial cells, which are not excitable. Right? These are these sort of supporting cells. These help neurons to carry out their job. We're going to talk about the physical support of the nervous system. This is going to tie into the anatomy structures we looked at, skull, meninges. We're going to talk about the blood supply to the nervous system and how the brain is quite sensitive to oxygenation and vascularization. And then we're going to talk about the blood-brain barrier and the histology or the microscopic structures that really form that barrier between the blood and the nervous tissue. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the gray matter and white matter. So let's start by looking at the functional and structural unit of the nervous system. This is your neuron. This is what we've been speaking about so far, right? That single cell, it has a soma or a cell body, which has some dendrites, and it has a long axon which projects down to the terminal. And at that area, it can synapse with many other neurons and so on. So these are responsible for sending chemical and physical responding to chemical and physical stimuli in the way of sending chemical and electrical messages. So the way that I keep referring to neurons is that they speak to one another, and I think that's the best way to represent how they interact. Right? One neuron is going to synapse onto another neuron, and they basically have a language that they're speaking using action potential. And they're communicating various messages, such as things that we touch, again, things that we feel, auditory stimuli, and so on and so forth. So they conduct electrochemical impulses in this way. So it's important to understand that a neuron takes the electrical energy that is an action potential, it transfers that energy into chemical energy at the synapse, right? If we recall talking about how an action potential triggers exocytosis of a neurotransmitter inside of that vesicle. And so electrical energy transmits to chemical energy, and then when that neurotransmitter binds on the postsynaptic side, that chemical energy is restored back to electrical energy. And in that way, neurons conduct electrochemical impulses. They also regulate the release of certain chemical neurotransmitters. So we spoke about the modulating neurons that help to regulate the nervous system function. And lastly, most importantly, they bring about perception of pretty much everything that we can think about. Memory, sight, understanding, learning, muscles, glandular tissue, the skeletal muscles, so movement, walking, talking, all of that stuff is brought about by the nervous system, specifically the neurons. Now, neurons cannot divide, but they can repair themselves quite well. Right? I teach a biology of aging class online, and a lot of what we see, we look at the aging that happens between different systems, and a lot of what we see in the nervous system is that it ages very well. And perhaps this is why, because neurons can repair themselves so well. Right? So, with the exception of specific areas of the brain, like the hippocampus and things that are involved in Alzheimer's, we'll talk about that in a minute, the brain has the ability to maintain itself and repair very well. But neurons can repair. All right, when we classify neurons, so neurons can be classified based on their structure, which is how they look, and they can also be classified on their function, which is how they act, or what function is about in the nervous system. So the structural classification is based upon the number of processes that extend from the soma, or the cell body. So on this basis, we can have a unipolar neuron, which has one process. We can have a bipolar, we can have a multipolar, we can have pseudopolar neurons. And that is basically how many processes extend from the cell body. Right, we're not really focused or interested too much in structural classification. What we're really focused on is the functional classification that has more meaning for us. So there are sensory neurons, motor neurons, and then there are interneurons, which are really involved in sensory and motor function. Okay, so the functional classification is the one that we're really going to be interested in. All right, so when we talk about the functional classification, this is based on what direction are these impulses, or what direction are these neurons communicating in. Okay, then there are three options here, two options. The sensory neurons, which conduct impulses from the sensory receptors, right? So in your fingers, in your eyes, on the retina, Throughout your body, you have different sensory receptors. They're picking up information from the world around you, and they're transmitting that information up into the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord. Okay. Then there are motor neurons. These are transmitting impulses and messages in the opposite direction. These are taking signals from the brain and conducting these impulses or signals down to the target organs or the affected tissue. Right? This can be your heart muscle, this can be your skeletal muscle, this can be your glandular tissue, your bladder, your liver, right? All of these organs in the body that are getting their sensory information from the brain do so by motor neurons. There are two types of motor neurons that are sort of highlighted in this image. And this is going to be more meaningful to us when we get to the autonomic and somatic nervous system. So this is your sensory neuron, again, bringing information from receptors about the world, touch, taste, and so on, up into the brain and spinal cord. Motor neurons are taking information in the opposite direction, and there are two types. Somatic motor neurons are bringing voluntary information about movement of skeletal muscle. So if you decide to get up and go to the bathroom, that's a message that comes from your brain or spinal cord, comes down via a somatic motor neuron, which allows you to get up physically and walk to the bathroom, right? Autonomic motor neurons are going to bring messages that are not voluntary, right? So things like heart rate, respiratory rate, digestion, the way we break down food, glandular tissue. These are autonomic functions. These are not controlled by us voluntarily, and these signals get to their effector tissue on autonomic motor neurons. Okay. And then the last type of neuron here, based on functional classification, is the association or the interneuron. And these are specifically found within the central nervous system. These do not cross out to the peripheral nervous system the way the other types of neurons that we saw. So interneurons are really communicating within the CNS, and they help to integrate function within the CNS itself. They do not leave the CNS. Hence the term interneuron. So from one CNS neuron to another CNS neuron. Okay. Any questions so far? Any questions? All right, so let's move on to talk about your glial cells. So we looked at your neurons, which are your main cells of the nervous system. Glial cells, although they are supporting or supportive in their role, they comprise the majority of the CNS. Okay, about 75 to 90% of the central nervous system is comprised of your neuroglia. And neuroglia is really all of these supporting cells that we're going to mention. So glial cells support our neurons. They're non-excitable. What does non-excitable mean? In the context of what we've discussed, what does non-excitable mean? What do I mean when I say a glial cell is non-excitable? Whereas a neuron is excitable. What's the difference there? Good. It cannot fire an action potential. It cannot transmit an action potential. It's just another supportive cell. It does communicate with neurons, but not in a way that is excitatory or using action. Now, there are several glial cells we'll talk about. I'll point a few of them out in this image. Right, so we'll talk about the ependymal cells in a bit, but really we're focusing on the astrocytes, the microglial cells, and the oligodendrocytes. So the astrocytes are these star-shaped cells. We'll talk about their function in a bit. They connect neurons to the other tissues in the brain. The microglial cells are sort of scavenger cells. They're part of the immune system. We'll talk more about them in a bit. And then finally, your oligodendrocytes are responsible for creating the myelin within the central nervous system. When we go to the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells are involved in the myelination of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. So I'll say that again. Oligodendrocytes are involved or responsible for the myelination in the CNS, which is brain and spinal cord. And then Schwann cells are responsible for the myelination outside of the CNS in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So there are 5 types of glial cells here. I'm not going to speak extensively about all of them. Astrocytes have several different functions. Those are probably the most important ones that we're going to talk about. Ependymal cells line the cavity of your ventricles, and they are responsible for producing that CSF, right, the cerebrospinal fluid. Can anyone remember the structure from our anatomy lab that produces CSF? Talk about a unique structure that was responsible for producing CSF in our lab lesson. Can anyone remember that structure? Anyone? No? All right, so the choroid plexus. So the choroid plexus is essentially a congregation of ependymal cells. The choroid plexus, which is that structure that lines the ventricles, it produces CSF, is a conglomeration or a group of ependymal cells which are secreting CSF. So if I tell you that ependymal cells secrete CSF, and I tell you that the choroid plexus secretes CSF, it's essentially the same thing. The ependymal cells form the choroid plexus. Microglial cells are phagocytic cells, and phagocytic means that they can engulf particles, they can engulf different structures or particles that are found among neurons. We'll talk about those in a bit. And then Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes are forming myelin, as we just mentioned. All right, astrocytes. Astrocytes. As the astro term, or the beginning of this term implies, these are named because they are shaped like a star. So these cells have quite a few processes that stick out with this star-like appearance, and this kind of lends to the function of this cell. So this is another example of where form follows function. So the astrocytes are really bridging the gap between the nervous tissue, which are your neurons and your excitable cells, and your non-nervous tissue. So your blood vessels, your extracellular tissue, and the extracellular fluid. Okay? So it has these foot processes that sort of stretch out so that they can communicate between neurons and non-nervous tissue. Okay? They also form the blood-brain barrier. We'll talk about how they form the blood-brain barrier later on. They're involved in modulating the synapse. So we spoke last time about modulating neurons. These were an additional neuron that interacted at the synapse and basically influenced how much neurotransmitter was released. Now, they were not involved in the membrane potential change. And this is just reinforcing astrocytes are not excitable. So this modulating neuron, this modulating cell, which is synapsing onto two neurons, is really only influencing how much neurotransmitter is released and not necessarily any change in the membrane potential. Okay? So in this way, they modulate synaptic activity. They can communicate to neurons through chemical messengers, but again, not through electrical messages, not through action codes. All right, so other functions here, they help to remove excess neurotransmitter from the cleft. So again, this is something we'll see continuing out through when we look at the muscles and the cardiac system. At the synaptic cleft, it's very important to clear away any excess neurotransmitter. Okay? If left lingering, that can become quite toxic, especially neurotransmitters such as glutamate and GABA. Okay, they can be quite toxic if they're left in high levels at the synaptic cleft. And so although we have certain enzymes to clear the neurotransmitter from the cleft, astrocytes also help in this process. They maintain the normal electrolyte composition of the interstitial fluid in the nervous system, all right, especially the levels of potassium. So they help to regulate the levels of potassium and sodium to a lesser degree that is found in the interstitial fluid. Or around the neuron, sorry, that's the interstitial. They protect neurons against toxic substances and oxidative stress. So another concept that we talk about in my biology of aging course is oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species. And this is basically these damaging free radicals that are made as a byproduct of cellular respiration that can be quite harmful to neurons, to other cells in the body. And so astrocytes help to protect neurons from the exposure to these reactive oxygen species and any oxidative stress that they could be seeing. Okay, so this oxidative stress is thought to be linked to aging in the nervous system. So essentially, astrocytes help to delay or protect against aging. And lastly, glycogen synthesis. So astrocytes have an ability to synthesize glycogen to a small degree. We'll talk about how the brain gets energy later on, but to a very small degree, astrocytes have the ability to synthesize some glycogen, which is storing away some glucose for energy later on. Okay. So those are your astrocytes. Quite a bit of functions, star-shaped, very important in supporting the neurons, but they are non-excitable. Let's talk about the microglia. Microglia also work very closely with astrocytes, and they sort of facilitate neurons to maintain a surrounding and protect them from any exposure to toxic substances. Okay, so they protect the central nervous system by phagocytosing or engulfing any bacteria, any debris, which is comprised of any dead or injured cells that may be lurking or floating around in the area. And they also protect from, again, that oxidative stress, which is created from any free radicals. So microglia are a function of, or microglia function in the immune system in that way in protecting the body, specifically the nervous tissue. Okay. All right, any questions so far? Any questions? Okay, so here we're going to talk a little bit about some clinical connections between glial cells and neurodegenerative diseases. So we'll talk about 3 diseases, just a little bit about how they're brought about and how glial cells play a role in the disease process. So multiple sclerosis is a disease, it's an autoimmune disease, and autoimmune just means that the body's attacking itself. So basically the body cannot identify or differentiate self from non-self, and so it attacks the oligodendrocytes, which are creating the myelin of the central nervous system. Attacking these cells means that there's less myelin around our central nervous system, around our brain, and around our spinal cord. Less myelin is going to do what? We spoke about the unique function of myelin. So having less myelin will do what?
Having less myelin will cause less insulation. Disrupt the electrical impulses.
Okay, good.
Slow it down.
Slow it down. Perfect. That's exactly right. So less myelin means we're going to disrupt the transmission of electrical impulses down the length of the neuron, which means we're going to have slowed or delayed transmission, which really translates in physical symptoms to weakness, paralysis. These patients usually have loss of vision because they have demyelination of the optic nerve, which transmits visual information, and a whole array of different symptoms, which basically lead to the loss of myelin in the CNS. Okay. Alzheimer's disease, on the other hand, is a loss of cholinergic neurons. Cholinergic neurons. And what happens in Alzheimer's is the glial cells recognize that there's a loss of these cholinergic neurons. And cholinergic just means that these neurons secrete what neurotransmitter? What neurotransmitter do cholinergic neurons secrete? Come on. Acetylcholine. Good. Acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is vital at the neuromuscular junction, at the neuroaffective junction. All right. So if we have a loss of cholinergic neurons, we can have a loss of transmission of signals. throughout the body. These glial cells sense the loss of cholinergic neurons and replace those neurons by plaques. Right? This scar tissue or this plaque is the glial cells' attempt to rectify the loss of these cholinergic neurons, and that essentially does more harm than good. Okay? So in this way, glial cells play a role in the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Now, clinically, Alzheimer's disease usually starts with symptoms like memory loss and confusion, and then it progressively declines where there's total loss of motor function, and then a steep decline in cognitive function. These patients can't remember who they are, can't remember the basic things, how to brush their teeth. They even forget or don't know how to eat, how to speak, how to swallow, how to chew. Right? And that is the ending stages of Alzheimer's disease. Parkinson's is caused by a loss of dopaminergic neurons, which are neurons that secrete dopamine, and these are really involved in movement, the movement pathways of the brain. So Parkinson's disease is sort of an opposite in terms of its progression to Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's starts with your memory loss and confusion, and then ends up with motor loss. Parkinson's is going to start with motor loss, right? So these patients can't talk very well. They can't hold anything, they have that shuffling, very slow gait, and then they develop cognitive decline as the disease progresses. And this is really caused by glial cells, again, which produce inflammatory agents. So again, we see here that these glial cells are trying to help the situation. They sense that there's a loss of certain neurons, and then they produce inflammatory agents, which really makes the patient worse. Right? So the progression of both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is directly related to the function of glial cells. Question, Madeline?
Starts with motor loss and
Cognitive decline. Whereas Alzheimer's is the opposite. You're going to start with your memory loss, confusion, and then you slowly move. Any questions on these clinical connections here? All right, so this is just pointing out how these glial cells play a role in